International Court of Justice has ruled that Israel's occupation of the West Bank is a de facto illegal annexation. The ICJ says it consists of, quote, systematic discrimination, segregation and apartheid. Well, RT's Middle East Bureau Chief Maria Finoshna in Jerusalem is joining me now. I mean, Maria, this is quite a bombshell verdict from really the highest court in all the lands. Just talk us through what this really means. What are the ramifications here?
Well, indeed, the International Court of Justice has just ruled that Israel's practices and policies in the West Bank and East Jerusalem are in breach of the international law, including the occupation law, that Israel had by far exceeded its role of the administrator in the occupied territories, and that its settlement policy and control over Palestinians that are not Israeli citizens amount to an illegal annexation and deprive Palestinians of their right for self-determination. And the court has also stated that Israel has an obligation to end its presence in those territories as rapidly as possible, as well as cease all settlement activity immediately. Factors considered by the judges included the duration of the occupation, of course, almost 60 years since 1967, active and aggressive expansion of Israeli settlements in the West Bank, which includes construction of thousands of units, relocation of a big number of Israeli settlers to Palestinian territories under protection of Israel, of course, exercising Israeli domestic laws in those communities, policy of impunity regarding the settlers' violence towards Palestinians, as Israel doesn't do enough to prevent or punish these violent acts, ongoing land confiscation and demolition of the houses that force Palestinians to leave, and equal to forcible displacement of the occupied population, which is also illegal, discrimination of Palestinians, also Israeli exploitation of natural resources of the occupied territories. The court's ruling came amidst ongoing calls for annexation from Israeli right-wing factions and statements by certain Israeli officials opposing a two-state solution. Just on Thursday, to remind you, the Israeli parliament passed a resolution rejecting the establishment of a Palestinian state, confirming Israel's official approach in this matter. Offering legal opinions to UN agencies is one of the ICJ's functions, and in this particular case, the judges were addressing an inquiry initiated by the UN General Assembly in response to the Palestinian Authority's request to determine if the almost 6 decades-long occupation could be classified as temporary. Why it's important? Because under international law, occupations are not universally prohibited. A temporary one could be permissible, which was Israel's primary defense. The court's February hearings were extensive, with over 50 countries giving evidence. Israeli delegation, by the way, was also there, but it decided not to cooperate with the process. And eventually, the court concluded that Israel's presence in the West Bank and Jerusalem is illegal and must end immediately. Back to you.
Well, I mean, it's obviously a big ruling by the ICJ, but it's also an advisory one, which means that it is non-binding. So I suppose the real question here is, what are the chances that it actually has any effect on the situation on the ground?
Well, indeed, the court's opinion is non-binding and won't immediately oblige Israel to act. But you have to understand that ICJ is the world's most important international tribunal at the end of the day, and countries take its opinions seriously. This decision could potentially result in resolutions against Israel at the UN Security Council. That is an even bigger deal, even though the US is likely to use its veto power there to shield Israel. It could also lead to the International Criminal Court to initiate criminal proceedings against Israeli officials in the West Bank. This ruling will likely further isolate Israel, that has already become sort of pariah state because of its deadly offensive in Gaza. It might potentially lead to increased economic and diplomatic pressure, including sanctions, companies that now have ties with Israel may reassess their relationships with the country, and the positions of certain states could shift as well. Currently, as you know, the US, EU, France, Canada and Britain have already imposed sanctions on a number of far-right Israeli activists and settlers over allegations of violence against Palestinians, along with illegal outposts and organizations involved in human rights abuses against Palestinians, including a group that works to prevent humanitarian aid from reaching Gaza. It's important to remind you that The Hague is also home to the International Criminal Court, whose chief prosecutor recently requested international arrest warrants against Prime Minister Netanyahu and Defense Minister Gallant, as well as Hamas leaders for their actions during the war in Gaza. And also the ICJ is currently hearing South Africa's case to determine if Israel commits genocide in Gaza. The investigation might take years, but all this, as you understand, is emphasizing the substantial legal pressure faced by Israel that cannot be ignored by this country.
I mean, Maria, I also just want to get your take on what reaction we've heard coming from Israel, because it was quite vehemently against the case being heard in the first place at the ICJ.
Absolutely, and we now receive reactions from different Israeli officials, all condemning the ICJ's ruling. Prime Minister has lashed out at the ICJ, lies, saying Jewish people do not occupy their own land. These are his words. The country's far-right finance minister, Smotrich, has posted just 2 words on social media following the verdict: sovereignty now, meaning the establishment of the Israeli rule over the Palestinian territory from the river to the sea. National Security Minister, settler politician Ben Gvir has slammed the court as anti-Semitic and political organization. One head of the Israeli regional councils has urged Netanyahu to immediately begin applying sovereignty to Judea and Samaria. That is a biblical name of the West Bank that Israel uses. What might happen next? Well, the court's decision might actually change nothing on the ground. As you remember, earlier in May, the ICJ ordered Israel to immediately stop its offensive in Rafah. And after that ruling, we saw the IDF intensifying its bombardment and shelling of Gaza's south, advancing deeper and deeper into Rafah near the Egyptian border. Netanyahu has repeatedly said that Israel will resist external interference in its decision-making processes, that it will not allow any international body, any international organization or foreign state to dictate Israel what to do and what not to do, which basically means that Israel will continue doing what it wants to. What might follow, though, more Jewish settlements in the West Bank and more economic restrictions on Palestinian Authority, like we saw after several European countries recognizing Palestine as a sovereign state. And at the end of the day, it might put even more burden on Palestinians, making their life even more miserable and harder. Back to you.
Now, RT's Middle East Bureau Chief Maria Finoshina bringing us all the very latest on that fresh ICJ ruling about Israel's actions in the West Bank. Thank you very much, Maria.